CNAS to the Center for New American Security. My name is Eli Ratner. I'm the Vice President and Director of Studies here at CNAS. Let me start off just also by thanking Susie Jakes and China File for co-sponsoring this event and helping it bring it together, as well as all the great reporting on this issue that China File has done. Also at the beginning, just want to say thank you to everyone in the room. This is a hand-selected crowd of people who have been committed to the issue that we're talking about today. We have Republicans and Democrats from Capitol Hill on both sides of the aisle. We have administration officials from the State Department and elsewhere, folks in the intelligence community, activists, researchers, of course, representatives from Human Rights Watch who have done some great work in this area, foreign government representatives and journalists from around town as well who have been trying to lift up profile on this issue. So thanks to everyone involved, and we're hoping, given the caliber of people in the room, to really have a conversation today, not just the two of us up here. But of course, among those who have been interested in working on this issue are Megha Rajagopalan. How did I do on that?
Good.
About right?
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
So far, so good.
Yeah.
Who's been reporting from Beijing on this issue, also on the ground out in Xinjiang, and has been, among others, I think, elevating this issue beyond just the more narrow China expert community. So I'm going to start off with just a few questions to get us rolling here, and then, again, invite others in the room who are working on these issues to share their experiences, ask questions, and we can have a good exchange here. So I'm going to start off then, I guess, a little more biographically than from a foreign policy perspective. Maybe just, Megha, if you want to start, why don't we start, for those who don't know you, share a little bit of your story, how you ended up going to China in the first place, the kind of issues that you were working on while you were there, and maybe what got you interested in the Xinjiang issue in the first place.
Yeah. So I basically had never thought about going to China until my senior year of college, when I discovered that there was this scholarship open to study at Hong Kong University, and nobody else had applied for the scholarship. So I thought that I would apply, and then I got it, and then I sort of went to Hong Kong and studied journalism there and did an internship at Time Magazine's bureau, and I just got really interested in how journalism is done in these kind of very repressive media environments, and so then I ended up going back as on a research grant, and then learned Chinese, and then signed on with Reuters, where I spent 4 years, mainly as a political correspondent. I started traveling to Xinjiang, way back when I was a student. I hitchhiked the Karakoram Highway and, saw a lot of the countryside, and just met a lot of people and was just really blown away by the natural beauty. That was, way back in 2008. A lot of the kind of human rights and repression elements were there, but on a kind of less of a noticeable scale, I think. And it was still pretty possible to go around and talk to people. You could go to bookstores and cafes and sort of things like that. And when I was at Reuters, I sort of continued to cover a lot of the Xinjiang issues around things like terrorism and violence, as well as some of the human rights stuff. And last year, after I signed on to BuzzFeed, I had this idea that I really, really wanted to do kind of a deep dive into the crisis there, just because we had heard in Beijing, the whole foreign correspondence community, we had heard that things were just getting a lot worse really quickly. And, I'm sort of blessed at BuzzFeed to have kind of more time and resources than a lot of, daily news journalists. So I thought I would use that to go out and see what the situation was really like. So a lot of the reporting that I've done since has come out of that original impulse.
And what was that like when you went out there? I think, and again, we'll get into the details of the substance, but from a tradecraft perspective, right? You land in the airport, you're in Urumqi, right. You're heading out. What's that like in terms of minders, access? Obviously, folks reluctant to talk to you, but just talk a little bit about sort of the reporting experience, and then we can get into a little more of what you were reporting on.
Sure. I think I want to talk a little bit about just this question of access. I think it's one of the things that kind of gets missed in the way that we talk about Xinjiang outside of China is that, how bad the access really is. So if you take any human rights crisis in the world today, so just take as an example, the drug war in the Philippines, which I've also covered. So the drug war is basically a situation where people are getting killed in the street or whatever, right, in the neighborhoods of Manila. And in that situation, you have not only reporters that are following this every single day, like a whole bunch of reporters, you have documentarians, you have people in the neighborhoods that are like posting pictures online and writing their accounts on Facebook, you have the police reports, you have what the president says, like you have NGOs, lawyers, like all of this kind of like big community of people that are putting out information. And in Xinjiang, there's like none of that stuff exists. It's really just mostly a bunch of reporters and researchers who go there from time to time and are pulling out information. So how does that work in practice? So it's not like Tibet where you need a permit to go there. You can just fly into Urumqi as a journalist and then take the train or drive a car, take a bus or something where you need to go. But the big problem is that either when you arrive at the airport or when you check into the hotel, generally speaking, you will be met by 2 police officers, and generally speaking, they'll ask like, what do you plan to do and stuff like that, and they may end up following you, as has definitely happened to some people in this room as well. And that sort of, it's not so much to intimidate you as it is to intimidate anybody who would want to cooperate or talk to you or provide you with any kind of substantial information. And if a big part of what you're trying to do is just to see the way that things are, it really prevents you from going to the places that you would like to go to. So, I mean, the other kind of factor there is that, the people that do get caught cooperating with journalists, of course, they can be sent to these re-education camps, right? So I think from an ethical perspective, and myself and a number of us have made this choice to do a lot of the reporting by speaking to exiles who are in places like Kazakhstan, Turkey, and other places in the West, to avoid kind of adding additional risk and the possibility of harm to people within China. But the kind of drawback of that then becomes that all of the information we get here outside is like on a delay. It's like delayed by 6 months, even a year sometimes. We find out about policies that were enacted in the region.
Okay. And then getting to, I guess, what you did see on the ground. Obviously, the internment camps are on the front pages of the New York Times and elsewhere these days, and we do want to talk about that. But if you could, I guess, your reporting has not been just on those, which have sort of been today's headlines, but the broader repression as it's associated with practice of religion and appearance and sort of daily life. So maybe I think, again, a lot of the folks in the room are familiar for this, but for those watching at home or elsewhere, what are the sort of most significant forms of oppression, separate from just the camps, we'll talk about in just a minute, but as it relates to daily life there in Xinjiang that you've seen or heard?
Right. So in general, we're talking about, the whole region has a population of something like, I think 22 or 23 million, and then Turkic Muslims, including Uyghurs and Kazakhs and others, I think it's about something like 13 million. And I think that the region has been described famously as an open-air prison, and I think that's like pretty close to reality. So like if you're a Uyghur, right, in a normal day, you are going to, you're going to hit a checkpoint where someone's going to scroll through your phone, or they'll put it in like a device, right? You may have to talk to a local Communist Party official about whether you practice your religion that day and that sort of thing. You will encounter all these facial recognition cameras. You'll have to go through airport-style security several times a day. All this stuff is in plain sight. It's visible. If anybody who travels there, like if you go as a tourist, you will see all of that stuff, right? So it's sort of like, I mean, as a thought experiment, if the camps didn't exist, right? If tomorrow they just all disappeared and we were left with were all of this kind of the effects of mass surveillance, it would still be an incredibly repressive kind of situation. And
I guess one of the questions I have, sort of thinking about is obviously huge objections to the way China has gone about dealing with what they perceive as a problem. Is it your sense from your reporting or others that there is a problem, that there are secessionists or splitists or extremists, as they would call it? Sort of what's the state of sort of what the kinds of issues that they're worried about, or is this more paranoia? Do you have any sense of that set of issues?
Yeah, I mean, there clearly has been separatist movements in Xinjiang. There are there's credible reports by the AP and others of Uyghurs that have gone to fight in Syria and would want to learn tactics and then go back and use them. There's Yeah, I mean, I think certainly the party does perceive this as a security threat, but I think the heart of the way that they see the issue is that this is kind of a flaw in people's way of thinking, and they attribute that to things like religion and culture, and you can sort of see this in their statements, right? They talk about things like the practice of Islam or Uyghur culture as a kind of virus, right, that needs to be eradicated. So I think what it amounts to is that there is a kind of genuine fear about stability that stems from some of the unrest that has happened in the past, but they've reacted to this by sort of imposing this like mass collective punishment on millions of people.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. No, that's an important point.
Yeah.
And so the camps themselves, I guess the one question that I have about this is, what do we know? What do we don't know? What don't we know? I mean,
Right.
obviously the Chinese officials have been out saying, no, this is vocational training, and they're
Right.
only there for a couple weeks. You've interviewed people who have been in these camps, but
Right.
again, access is very difficult. What's your own sense of how well we understand what's happening, or what is happening there?
Right.
And how much don't we know still?
Yeah, so there's three kind of big sources of information about what's happening in the camps. One is witness accounts, right? So like people who have been to the camps and left. There's like a handful of people that have like visited relatives in the camps and then they left China. That was sort of in the early days where you could still do that. That's not happening so much anymore. Those witness accounts, I think, are really the core of kind of what we know about life inside the camps. How we know about conditions like food deprivation, sleep deprivation, people being held in stress positions, as well as the kind of indoctrination, the type of stuff that happens. The second thing is like satellite imagery. So there's a guy named Sean Zhang in Canada who's been looking at a lot of this stuff. He's an independent researcher. Wall Street Journal, New York Times have used this imagery to document kind of the growth of the camps. And if you look on Google Earth, you can look at historical images and see how these places have really like expanded. And the third is records, like things like procurement records, which have many of which have now disappeared from the Chinese internet, but were once used by researchers like Adrian Zenz in Germany to document the kind of like equipment that was being sent to these camps, as well as the scale and the amount of resources that were pouring in. So other than that, I mean, they've sort of been acknowledged, like their existence is acknowledged by state media. Occasionally in the past, there would be these like Xinjiang state media reports about, like a ribbon cutting for a new camp or something like that. And that would give you like a sense of where these places are and what they look like and, whether they're like repurposed schools or hospitals or things like that.
Okay, great. And I'm gonna look to the audience to jump in here in just a minute. Maybe just one last question before we get to the discussion, which is, for you, I guess personally, because people would answer this in different ways, but really, what is this a story about, right? Is this a story about a narrow issue in Western China? Is this a story about Xi Jinping and the direction that he's taking China? Is this a story about the Communist Party and sort of its inherent insecurities and the result of that?
Right.
Is this a story about, I know, an issue set that is interesting that you've been reporting on of sort of high-tech authoritarianism,
Right.
as you've called it? Maybe it's all of those, but when you look at this and you step back for a minute, what's the broader context of what's happening out there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's probably two things to me. Like as you say, there's any range of answers on this, but I mean, one of the things that I think is important about this is like, we used to talk about the Washington consensus versus the Beijing consensus, right? So, and the notion that China and countries that are like China are going to export a certain brand of authoritarianism or like a philosophy of governance. And what Xinjiang it's not just a philosophy of governance; it's actually the toolkit. And they are exporting it, right? Like most of that surveillance state has been built by these kind of small and medium Chinese companies. And if you look at these companies' public statements, if you look at their financial statements, they're very keen on kind of growing their global profile. And they sort of reduce the price point for a lot of this technology in the same way that Chinese companies have done for all kinds of products. And they're selling the stuff to places like Ecuador and Malaysia, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe. There's like, I think in the course of reporting this, like I had this kind of aha moment when I sort of thought about this and I was like, there's nothing preventing anybody from doing this. If you have the access to the technology, why shouldn't any government that is not happy with some minority group or some political group, be able to use this exact same method, on their population? I think the only barrier between that like the only barrier ahead of that happening is the kind of lack of technical know-how around things like big data and predictive policing and all that sort of stuff. And so to me, it's almost like a matter of time before we start to see these kinds of methods in broader use. The second thing I would say is this like the kind of international response to this, or the lack thereof, I would say is like it's sort of says something to me about the nature of Chinese power, especially in international institutions like the UN. I think if you could make an argument that if this were any other country, less powerful country that was doing the same sort of thing, there would be a far more vocal response. So like now the question is does the nature of Chinese power in the 21st century, does that mean that 1 million people disappear into camps and nobody says anything? Is that what it's going to be like? Yeah.
Right. Right. Well, it's not what it's like here today, so
good.
that's why we're all
Yes.
gathered.
Yeah.
But let me open it up if folks want to jump in here. Just please, Susie. I don't know if you wanted to start with a question or comment. If not, we can go elsewhere. Maybe just wait for the microphone so we can capture it on the for folks not here in the room. No, just here. Thanks.
Thanks, and thanks so much to CNAS for organizing this, for coming. I wonder if in the course of your reporting you had any sense of any negative reaction among Han Chinese people to this campaign, and what your sense is of the awareness levels of people who are not directly involved in the programs to surveil Uyghur and Kazakh families. Is there any sense that there's any resistance to this of any form?
And levels of awareness, I guess.
Right.
And awareness,
Right.
primarily awareness.
It's an interesting question because this is sort of different from a lot of human rights issues in China, where there's this kind of take the Dalai Lama for instance. Like for years, there's been this kind of full-throated campaign in state media to sort of defame him and say that he's trying to tear the country apart and this and that. And in Xinjiang, there at least for this particular issue, there really hasn't been that. In fact, there was zero response, I think, until the recent statement by the UN panel on the elimination of racial discrimination. And then they sort of felt that they had to respond. And then since then, the Global Times has put out a few articles basically saying, yes, this kind of re-education campaign exists, but it's justified, sort of thing. So I think in the absence of that kind of propaganda effort, it just means that awareness of this is super low. And I think a big part of that is censorship. Another big part of it is that Chinese people consume news in Chinese language and not in English, which is where most of these articles are written in English, I guess. So I think it's just not on people's radar. I mean, I've definitely heard from Chinese friends and acquaintances who live abroad that they have started to consume news on the subject. But I think that the prerequisite is either it's both a VPN and the willingness to read news in a foreign language, which just doesn't exist on a wide scale.
Oh, just here.
Well, thank you for the great talk. I'm a big fan.
Thanks.
So thanks for the good reporting.
Yeah.
I want to ask a little bit about kind of why now, right? So you said that
Yeah.
a lot of this repressive infrastructure, at least intent, dates back a while, probably to 2009 riots, but maybe even before. It seems that one answer is the provincial party secretary
Right.
coming from Tibet to Xinjiang. So then the following question would be, why haven't we seen this kind of repressive infrastructure with technology, but especially the camps in Tibet or other places that theoretically would have some kind of analogous
Right.
application, right? They also have problems with Tibetans,
Right.
and it seems that there's no real reason that it would just apply to Xinjiang and not other places. So
Right.
do you have any thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. So the first thing that I would point out is that access in Tibet is actually worse than Xinjiang because practically speaking, as a journalist, you have to have an invitation from the government to go. And if you get that invitation, it's basically through this kind of North Korea style guided tour. So you're not really seeing a whole lot. That being said, the Tibetan exile community, they have a government in exile. They're extremely organized. They're good at speaking to journalists, and they're also very good at keeping tabs on kind of the situation within Tibet. So I think if there were things like re-education camps happening on this broad of a scale in Tibet, we would know about it. As far as the surveillance stuff, I mean, I've tried to talk to folks in the Tibetan community about this. I think a lot of the kind of like similar mechanisms are in place, like things like controls on movement, within that region, checkpoints certainly, facial recognition certainly, all of that sort of stuff. But it just, I think because of the lack of access, it perhaps hasn't gotten, that much attention. As far as the re-education camps, like, I genuinely think it's, like, I think the purpose of the camps is what the government says it is, which is to eradicate, religion and culture from that group of people. They perhaps don't feel like such an urgency to do that with the Tibetans, because the primary problem they had with them was the self-immolations, and we haven't seen self-immolations, at least in large numbers, for quite a while.
Nathan Weininger with 21 Wilberforce. Thank you for this presentation. My question is, several months ago, Microsoft released a statement that was very glowing about how they were contributing AI code to Chinese civil society, and this was going to be very important for civil society development. I'm wondering, on the technology front, are you seeing American or Western technology being leveraged and used for repression? Are we building the rails to the concentration camps again?
This is not a situation where there are like big American companies that are household names that are contributing to like the construction of re-education camps, or even too much, I don't think, to much of the surveillance technology. There are like kind of mid-sized American companies that some of which have been documented by Human Rights Watch and other organizations that are doing things like working on like big data platforms, for instance. But I mean, by and large, to me, like that hasn't been like a huge aspect of this story, like kind of like complicity of Western organizations. There's a question the other way, like, a lot of these Chinese companies that are building some of the surveillance equipment, where are they exporting that stuff? Who are they selling it to? Stuff like that. But I think a number of journalists have looked into this and sort of come up with that type of response. Yeah.
I had a question about the numbers of people who are going through these camps. So the State Department made a statement to the New York Times the other day with a very wide range, saying it was between hundreds of thousands or possibly millions. And I'm just wondering how you're handling the challenge of trying to get your arms around the numbers involved here. How are you trying to put those numbers together, and how confident do you feel about some of these estimates, particularly those very high-end estimates of possibly millions?
Yeah, so really good question. So let me just briefly talk about how those numbers are arrived at. So by and large, a lot of those numbers come from, of course there's no official figures, right, because they don't really accept that there is mass internment at all. The government doesn't. So by and large, those numbers have been arrived at by extrapolating from things like kind of local media reports about how many people in a certain town or village have been sent to re-education. I think Adrian Zenz has done some research extrapolating from basically government procurement records as to like how big the camps are and like how many people they could hold. There's also things like witness accounts and sort of stuff like that. But this is really more art than science. That's why that range is so wide, because it's very hard to be confident of the exact number of people, even to say like hundreds of thousands versus like a million or whatever. The other thing I would emphasize is that the camps, that million figure, that doesn't represent the total number of people that are incarcerated in the region, right? So if we're talking about actual prisons, like people who have been through some sort of arrest and judicial process, that number is like almost equivalent. I believe it's a fifth of the total prison population in China is in Xinjiang, and it's like Xinjiang represents like something like 1.5% of the population of China. There's not that many people that live there. So I don't know about millions. Like, I would be more inclined to say, personally, hundreds of thousands up to a million, just based on accounts that I've heard and research that I've read. But like I said, like different people have different views on this.
That's a great question. We'll go here and then we'll come over to the side.
First of all, thank you for coming and presenting. My name is Briggs Burton. I'm with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. My question, leaving aside the range of numbers, even the low end represents a significant percentage of Xinjiang's population.
Yeah.
And based on the reporting I've read, I'm given to understand it's predominantly male. How is this affecting sort of society, like daily life in Xinjiang? Or I presume just sort of vacant businesses, family positions left entirely open? Like, how are Uyghurs coping with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's been left out is the kind of psychological toll on families, which is impossible to calculate, but I mean, will last a generation or more, like, for sure. Yeah, a lot of households have lost, like, the male family members. Some of them have lost both parents. In a lot of these cases, children are given over to state-run orphanages, which is really bad. There's also indoctrination elements there. Lots of the people who've gone to these camps are working on kind of like small family farms and things like that. I mean, you can't pause a farm, right? Like, you know, the work there has to be done. Early on in my reporting, like kind of early to mid last year, I was hearing people talk about like small amounts of compensation. That has stopped, to my knowledge. There's other elements here about like Uyghurs who have gone abroad. By and large, they've just completely lost touch with their families. That has been incredibly stressful. I was in Australia about a month ago, and I was at a Uyghur restaurant meeting someone, and the waitress came up to me and just she introduced herself and immediately started crying, and it was because like her 5-year-old daughter, she had left in Guangzhou, and she hadn't spoken to her in a year because she left thinking, you know, she was going to go on this trip to Australia, and then ended up not being able to go back because she didn't want to get set. She had made this choice, like, I would rather stay abroad, like away from my family, rather than, you know, go back and risk being sent to a camp, I guess. So, I mean, people are just being confronted with those choices every day. It's like impossible to calculate how many families this has impacted, but I mean, I think it's like a lot of Uyghurs would say like there's elements of the culture have already been destroyed and probably will never come back. Yeah.
Hi, Tom Kellogg, Georgetown Law School. Thanks so much for your talk. My question has more to do with your own individual case. Obviously, everyone in this room is aware that your visa was not renewed, and this is not the first time that China has gone this route to get someone out of the country. The New York Times went through its visa blockade, I guess about a year or so ago. And at that time, there was some conversation here in Washington and up in New York and elsewhere about whether or not the U.S. government should respond to these cases by blocking visas for Chinese journalists coming to the United States. I wonder if you have a comment on that, or if you think there are other steps the U.S. government could take to support U.S. media organizations working in China when cases like this happen. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I would have to say, like, you know, I've probably said as much as I would want to say about my personal case, and I guess as a journalist, I don't necessarily know that it's the right role for me to be playing to, you know, tell the U.S. government what to do on any specific policy issues, so I'd probably have to leave it at that.
But if others have a response to that,
Yeah,
it'd be
for sure.
welcome.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of people
Yeah.
in the room from the Hill and
Yeah.
elsewhere who are actively looking at that issue, so welcome responses from others. Yeah, we'll come back over here in the back.
Thank you, Dr. Radner and CNAS for putting this on, and thank you, Megha, for coming to present to us. My question is about some of the expats in the Uyghur community. You know, what we often hear is that part of the reason why for years this hasn't gotten the sort of traction that Tibet gets is because there's not that unifying, charismatic one leader to speak for Uyghurs. And I'm wondering if you can say a bit about what you are seeing, if that doesn't reveal anything, about the movement of Uyghur expats trying to bring attention to the issue, but more so than attention, advocating for something to be done, which is that next step.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. Yeah, so I think a lot of us have noticed that, you know, when we started reporting on this issue, like, early to mid last year, it was very, very difficult to get people to talk because they were afraid. They thought, if quite accurately, like if my name shows up in on the internet or in a paper or something, then my family will be retaliated against. So that's changed, and now, and I mean, it's sort of changed for a bad reason, which is that people are just so hopeless now that they feel that they can't prevent this outcome no matter what they do, so they might as well try to raise attention about the issue. I think the question you raised about unification is an interesting one because I think there is this problem that they don't have somebody like the Dalai Lama or something like that. But that kind of lack of unity, it's been exacerbated by a very intentional campaign by the Chinese government to sow discord and mistrust in that community. And that campaign, I think, has been super effective. Like, people don't protest; they don't go to public events. Like, if you look at a Uyghur protest, like if you look at photographs, a lot of people will have their faces painted over because they're afraid of being photographed. And this is in Western countries, right? Democratic countries. And like you'll just hear, like in my experience, like I'll give you an example. So I was interviewing somebody who had provided me with a bunch of like text messages and emails that he had had with a state security representative, and these were all in Uyghur language. So I wanted to get somebody else to translate them, right? So I could know that they were accurate and said what he said. That they were saying, but he we had this protracted battle because he wouldn't trust anybody else in the community basically to see these documents or whatever. So I think that maybe would be different. I think in a different community, but the reason that he was so worried about it was because he sort of suspected that there were other people in that community that were spying on him, and I think that's actually a very common concern, and it's really harmed, I think, their movement overseas.
Can I ask you, just before we go to the next question, about how you think we've seen obviously the Chinese government feeling compelled to respond to some of the criticism they've been receiving.
Right.
What role does the international community play in all of this? If there is more discussion, more leadership from a variety of communities, do you think that would change the behavior of what's happening out there, or where do you think that plays in what's happening inside China?
I mean, I definitely do think that, public pressure and pressure from governments has changed the Chinese government's behavior on human rights concerns. There's a number of examples, like two of the most prominent ones were the recent release of Liu Xiaobo's wife, and the release of the 5 feminists a couple of years ago. And if you talk to diplomats who work on this, they'll tell you that in a lot of situations, like the kind of combination of public and private pressure will lead to the government kind of releasing people or treating political prisoners better, kind of on a case-by-case basis. I think in this particular situation, it's clear that they're sensitive to the international pressure. Like, you can see that the way they responded to that UN panel, like with a lot of ferocity. So I think there's like any number of kind of policy options, like for the U.S. and from the kind of international, like UN type picture. I think that could elicit a good response. Yeah.
Here, Don, why don't we come around here? No, here, Max, we'll come to this side for just a couple more questions.
Thank you. Don Clark, GW Law School. And this question, maybe not just for you, but for anybody in the room, is there any empirical evidence that indoctrination campaigns like this work, actually? It's hard for me to imagine somebody being subjected to this and coming out thinking, gosh, I guess I do love the Communist Party, right? It's when you put people in isolation, that you have these effects, but not in this kind of case. And if that's the case, does anybody in the Chinese government really think it's going to work? Because if it doesn't work, then of course there's really two other alternatives. One of which is you keep Xinjiang kind of a prison forever, and that's really expensive. Just to keep someone in Rikers Island apparently costs $271,000 a year.
Right.
Which leads to the second possibility, and that is something that we haven't talked about yet, which is that the goal is basically through declining birth rates, essentially the extermination of the Uyghur ethnicity. And I'm wondering, there should have been enough time for that to start to show up in the numbers, because this policy has been going on, for a few years. Is anybody looking at birth rates? Is that information kind of out there?
So maybe just let's start with sort of the how does this end question, and then maybe
does it work and how does it end? Yeah. Okay. So Does it work? I mean, some people would point to the Falun, like the most immediate precedent for this is the Falun Gong treatment. I actually haven't followed that too closely myself, so I don't want to say too much about it. It's sort of hard to know whether, like, what's the metric of success here? Like, you can't really measure what's in someone's heart. But I think, the fear of being sent to one of the camps or having a family member sent to one of the camps is perhaps more convincing on you to change your behavior and your ideology than the actual things that you're being forced to learn. Whether there's any dissent within the party, it's very hard to know, but there was, I believe, a paper published in the, I want to say the Xinjiang Academy of Social Sciences, where there was an academic who basically said, this campaign is not being carried out in a way that, like a logical way. Like, there are, I think she made reference to quotas for people in towns that are being sent to the camps, and basically said that it was an overreach. And I think that was interesting to me because it sort of alludes to a level of chaos that I think we underestimate. A lot of these decisions are made on the ground by kind of like local officials that want to look good to their higher ups. Because this is not like a penal system, right? So there's no kind of arrest paperwork, nobody's being charged with anything. So there's like kind of very little information by way of like, why are people actually being sent to these camps, right? So it just provides a lot of impunity for local officials, I think, in a way that leads them to make decisions that defy logic, Your second question was,
where does this end? Or where is this all headed? What options do they have?
Right.
Unwind?
The
Or,
second question
Yeah.
really is there really another agenda here?
Right.
Which is, you lock up all the men
Right.
between 18 and 40.
Yeah.
You don't need to lock up the women. And you make everybody really depressed and hopeless. Those are two things that are going to lower a birth rate.
Yeah, there are lots of, there's incentives for intermarriage, basically, between Uyghur and Han people. And there's lots of accounts of things like forced marriages, which I have never been able to substantiate. Doesn't mean it's not true, but I just personally have not substantiated them. As far as birth rates, in the context of the one-child policy, right? So, like, Uyghurs are among the kind of rural and minority populations that were allowed to have more than one child. So to my knowledge, that continues to today. Whether there's going to be kind of a decline that shows itself in the future, I'm not really sure. I can't say. Yeah.
we'll come up here to Ed.
Thanks, Megha. Edward Wong from the New York Times. I've seen some reports that there's also some state-sanctioned sort of persecution of Muslims in the Hui population.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if that's something you've looked at or that you've picked up on in your time in China.
Yeah, so I can't really speak from personal experience on this because I've never really reported too much on the Hui population, but to my knowledge, like the kind of common thread between what's happening with the Uyghur and the Hui is that the Hui are seeing like kind of more restrictions on the practice of Islam. So, like, for instance, there will be like mosques will have like loudspeakers taken down, right? So that they can't broadcast the call to prayer anymore. And then there's sort of like isolated reports of people saying they can't go to like religious education, even at state-sanctioned mosques and things like that. So I think there's like some of that kind of like state-sanctioned Islamophobia is sort of starting to encroach on the Hui, but obviously Hui are much better integrated than the Uyghur. They speak Mandarin, they look Chinese. I think that sort of remains true, I guess. Yeah.
Ed, did you have anything else to come in on as your reaction to hearing the discussion so far? Fine, if not, but curious whether if you want to just take the.
I still have, I mean, sort of.
Or do you want to just take the mic back, so folks?
Oh yeah, one thing that question I think that still remains out there, and it's sort of related to the question he had, is the question of timing of why now. Like, there's the theories of Chen Chuanghua and coming from TAR, but sort of like the 2009 was the largest outburst of violence, and then there were a lot of violent incidents up until around 2014. But it seemed like that starting after 2014, the violence itself had ebbed in Xinjiang, and also you saw that some of these policies, sort of like the banning of full veils and things, had actually taken effect, so that a lot of the practices of certain types of Islamic practices were already on the ebb in Xinjiang for several years before 2016. But then in 2016, 2017, they start this program on steroids. And so it's a weird, the timing is strange because it seemed like there was a 2 to 3 year period where a lot of the outcomes that they wanted were already starting to take effect in Xinjiang.
How would you answer your own question?
I don't know. Right.
Be interested in others' reaction as well. Sophie, I'm going to put you on the spot in just a minute because I know Human Rights Watch just put out a huge report on this, so be interested in you coming into the conversation here. But let's just pick up a couple more hands here.
Thanks for a fantastic presentation. I was just wondering, going on the theme of the side of the story that's taking place in the diaspora all across the world in terms of pressure to return home, pressure on people speaking out, visa cancellations, passport revocations, other measures to get people to return home.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there are unique challenges, not just for you, but for other reporters in reporting on that story as a unified story, since it's taking place in all different countries around the world, in all different languages. Like I know there's just a case in Turkey.
Right.
So I'm wondering if is that something where, as a newsroom, say, you guys have resources to pool on a geographically dispersed story like that, or is
Right.
that outside of the normal way your beats are structured?
Yeah, so I mean, for our newsroom, it's not difficult because we're small and I'm just the person that does this issue. So as a practical matter, it hasn't really made that kind of impact. When I used to work in a bigger newsroom, it was more difficult because, this used to be a much more niche issue than it currently is. So it's like you have to I remember when all that stuff was happening in Egypt, these Uyghur students were being forced to go back. Like, it's not that easy to tell your Cairo bureau to drop all the other important stuff that they're doing and focus on this, and they've never heard of it before. So I think that kind of thing can be a problem. I think the thing that's helpful in kind of a perverse way is that this is happening all over the world, but the common thread is most of these countries are really doing not very much about it. Some of them are worse than others. Some of them are repatriating Uyghurs that are going to then be detained. But by and large, there's not too many countries that are actively helping Uyghurs deal with this problem of spying within their communities and harassment from abroad. Yeah.
We had a hand way in the back here. Or actually, Max, all the way in the back. Yeah.
Thanks, Shanti Kalathal from the National Endowment for Democracy. First, thank you so much for your reporting. It's been spectacular, and I think it helped set the trend for a lot of more reporting after that. I had seen a document yesterday circulating about a company called Leon Technology, which seems to be quite involved in building out the infrastructure there.
Right.
And in that translation of that document, it said your reporting was one of the few pieces that picked up on the role of that company. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, as well as another piece in that document said that at the time that this document was put together, it sounded as though the monitoring and surveillance that was being done was primarily dependent on human surveillance, that is, people actually physically monitoring footage, as opposed to artificial intelligence augmented surveillance tactics.
Right.
And in the years since that document came out, I'm wondering if you've seen any shift or whether you can comment on whether we're seeing more advanced forms of machine learning applied to surveillance in Xinjiang in particular.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting question because it's about how they're clearly gathering all of this data, right, in different forms. I guess the question is about how good are they at actually analyzing it, sort of thing. So Leon is one of I kind of picked Leon as an example in a much longer piece, but Leon is just one of the more kind of visible in terms of its public statements. Companies that are kind of building out this kind of mass surveillance network in Xinjiang. And I thought Leon was interesting because they talk about how Xinjiang is this kind of center for their R&D kind of thing. This is sort of a place where they can test out a lot of their surveillance equipment. I just lost my train of thought. Sorry, can you repeat the second part of your question?
With the machine learning.
Machine learning. Yes. So I think what we do know for sure is that the government has in its public statements basically said, this is a big part of our next 5-year plan. Xi Jinping and other officials at very high levels in the Communist Party have sort of talked about the uses of AI in terms of maintaining national security, which is sort of how the lens through which they see this Xinjiang situation. Meng Jianzhu, who is the top domestic security official in China, has talked about this specifically with respect to Xinjiang. And we can see that they are really pouring, lots and lots of money into this. Like domestic security spending in Xinjiang has gone up by a lot. We've seen procurement documents that a lot of that money is going towards AI. So it's not really that possible to kind of pull back the curtain and look at their capabilities per se. For like the example that you raised, basically like video, right? Like video of a street corner. Like how good are they at picking out who's in that video and following them elsewhere? That kind of question is sort of hard to answer, but I think to me it's the kind of political will is there and the resources are there, right? So they may be not super good at it now, but to me it's like if they keep on this path, it's like a matter of time.
So there have been reports that the Chinese government views Xinjiang as like their gateway to the West through the Belt and Road Initiative,
right.
and a lot of ethnic Kazakhs have also been caught within the re-education camps. So how do you see those Central Asian governments responding to the fact that their citizens are being detained in these re-education camps?
Yeah. So I mean, by and large, they haven't really been responding, but the Kazakh government did refuse to extradite a number of its citizens, which was a big move for them. Like, I think nobody really expected that was going to happen, and they decided that they just weren't going to have it. And I'm sure that they have faced consequences for that. I think, yeah, in the context of the Belt and Road, I think that like the Belt and Road is a kind of a big reason that we haven't seen a more vocal response from governments of Muslim countries, as well as that kind of like network of Central Asian countries. So like the kind of very obvious example of this is Turkey. So a couple of years ago, kind of in that 2014, 2015 period, there were protests outside of the Chinese embassy in Turkey all the time. There were like statements from the government. There were lots of Uyghurs that had managed to leave China that were resettling in Turkey and getting permanent status. Like all of that stuff was happening. I went to Turkey most recently, like earlier this year, and I was talking to Uyghur activists about it, and they were like, well, this just can't happen anymore. Like basically, if they engage in that similar kind of public protest, it will be shut down by the Erdogan government. And that is because of Chinese diplomatic pressure as well as the economic relationship. And I think that dynamic is mirrored like all across these other countries that are big parts of the BRI campaign.
And I think the question there in part is, as the public profile of this issue rises, how
Right.
easy is that going to be in these countries where they may start to face popular pressure
Right.
in some of these countries? So there may be some opportunity there. I did want to give Megha a little break here and just reach out to folks. I know there's a lot of folks who work on the policy side of this issue, whether friends from Capitol Hill want to offer a view or not. But Sophie, maybe if you wanted to kick us off, if you don't mind, maybe just reflecting a little bit on the report you guys just put out, what to add from the discussion we've had today, as well as from the policy recommendation side, what opportunities do you think there might be?
Unprepared for this, but
Yeah, sorry to put you on the spot. But,
that's okay. Eli, thanks for hosting. Megha, it's great to see you, and thank you for all your extraordinary work. I would like to come back actually with a question about, whether China is a hard place to report on and in, as Megha and Edward can talk about. And maybe one of the encouraging aspects of all of the coverage of what's happening in Xinjiang is that it means that editors are still willing to run those stories.
Yeah,
which
true.
Counts for a lot. But I'd be interested in any of your observations about whether you think journalists themselves are getting worn down, right? I mean, 10 years ago, Beijing was just the place to be for lots of journalists. It was exciting, there was a lot to do, you had a little bit more latitude to operate, and I wonder if you feel like it's grinding people down faster than it did then. But just, Eli, maybe one dimension that about Xinjiang that hasn't gotten discussed as much today, we've touched on it a little bit, that we tried to look at in the report that we put out last week, is about the Chinese government reaching out beyond its borders to effectively terrorize people in Turkic Muslim diaspora communities into not seeking help, not talking to each other. I mean, we've talked about spying within communities or mistrust within communities. But I think one of the angles from which governments must now engage this topic is to not just say to Beijing, we're concerned about what you're doing to people in Xinjiang, but we see you reaching into our countries and tormenting people here, and that is not acceptable. And we're watching this week what different governments are saying at the Human Rights Council. I think many of those interventions, while they're welcome, they're also exactly what Beijing expects, and therefore they aren't necessarily all that consequential, and they have to be leading towards a larger, more effective diplomatic push to close the camps. So I think it's important that people understand that the Strike Hard campaign isn't just happening inside Xinjiang. It's happening in Northern Virginia. It's happening in the suburbs of Berlin. It's happening in downtown Sydney, as Megha and I experienced a month or so ago when people got up and left an event at Lowy because they were afraid to be there when we were talking about Xinjiang. So I'll just throw that observation, and that gauntlet down.
Did you want to come back on the journalists?
Yeah, definitely. Really good point. Like, can't be emphasized enough. Like how Sophie was just making reference to this event that she spoke at the Lowy Institute, where somebody just walked out, right, because they were afraid of being photographed or being seen at an event about human rights in China, like in downtown Sydney. That's really bad. Whether it's grinding people down. I mean, I think one of the mechanisms that has ground people down, I think, is like, so practically speaking, you're in a bureau in Beijing and you're taking reporting trips to other places in the country. So for most of us, every time you take a trip, you sort of have to justify that to your superiors, right? You justify the expense, the time, all of that sort of stuff. And you justify that by saying, well, I need to take this trip because I'm going to get this thing that I can't get without taking the trip. So if I'm going to do that in Xinjiang, what I can get is actually like very little, right? Because you can't really talk to people that much. You can't really move around too much without being followed. And that has gotten, like, just moving around has gotten a lot harder. So I think the result of that a lot of times is that people just don't take those trips. They'll go somewhere easier, right? And that's sort of become different just because this has become such a big news issue now. But I mean, it took a while, I think, for people to take those trips and do the work. And like I said, a lot of people have used the same methodology that I did initially, which is to actually go to other places and interview Uyghurs overseas. But not everybody works for a news organization that has the resources or is like going to allow them to do that sort of stuff. So I think that has sort of stifled coverage of the issue, in a much more direct way than an editor saying this is going to irritate the Chinese government, sort of thing.
Okay, so we're running out of time. This is an extremely heavy topic, so I wanted to end on maybe a slightly different note, which is that maybe just let folks know what's next for you, what you're going to be doing, where you're going to be heading, and what you'll be reporting on with your next iteration here.
Yeah, I'd love to, keep in touch with all of you. My new job is on, it's still covering, I guess you could say, tech and human rights. So a lot of it is going to be on the impacts of technology on populations, in the Middle East and elsewhere in the global South. In addition to this, I've done a lot of work on Facebook and the kind of like issues around Facebook and hate speech and stuff like that. So I'm hoping to continue doing that. I'm going to be based out in the Middle East and traveling quite a bit, and hope to definitely keep in touch with this Xinjiang issue, at least as far as it pertains to mass surveillance, for sure.
No, that's great. And we're going to be, here at CNAS, we're going to be doing a lot of work around this topic of high-tech illiberalism as we're framing it. It is an issue that requires different communities coming together, because it's not an issue just for policymakers or area experts. We need technologists and the private sector and the public sector and the media, education, and others coming together at once. So thanks to everyone for being here today. I guess as a closing note, I'll just say, again, to end up on a more positive note, I think everyone in this room still believes that people want to be free. And, my dad taught me that long ago. And the good guys are going to win in the end, but it's going to take everyone in this room and many more to keep at it. So thank you. Thank to everyone in the room. And thanks, Megha, for being here today.
Thank you.